Okay, welcome back to another Shadows and Ink podcast. And today our guest is David Noone. And we're going to be talking about horror and mental health. Now I'm going to turn it over to him and let him introduce himself. So take it away.
Well, yes, I'm David Noone. I'm the author of Saint of the City, published by Murderston Press. I'm here today courtesy of lorazepam, diazepam, temazepam, fluoxetine, mirtazapine, lisdexamfetamine, and most importantly, nicotine. Um, and we will be discussing mental health, as Anita said.
Okay, so um, mental health, especially in writing and for writers, can be controversial in a lot of ways, and it can be touchy subject, and a lot of people maybe don't want to touch it. But there are certain subgenres of horror that delve into it quite a bit and quite often. The things like psychological horror, the controversial Lovecraftian genre, and the one I want to talk about first is poetry, because I know for me, a lot of my poems are very personal. They delve into a lot of emotional issues, and I've used a few of them to deal with grief as well. So I'd like to know your thoughts on poetry and how it can help mental health, how you can use it to showcase some mental health issues and things like that.
Um, well, I think first of all, well, poetry is it's probably the one that uses mental health not as a trope. It's probably the one that uses it in a most sort of personal way. It's like as a manner of catharsis. Whereas in the other subgenres, it's usually a trope or a device. So I think when you think of like you can trace it right back um, to the very beginnings of poetry, but I think what you're referring to more so is this is more like the confessional poets, like, and that would really, I suppose, start with Dickinson, but Sylvia Plath, Ted Hughes, John Berryman, um, and then that's developed into now people like Donald Lynch, who I think is one of the best poets around, actually, and she writes about mental health very well, and it's a very personal thing with her. I think it's it's not just part of the story, so it's a direct venting or catharsis more so than it would be in a short story or a
Yeah.
novel.
Yeah. I think you can get more visceral with poetry too. And you can go, I'm not sure if you can go darker because I mean, I know a lot of horror books go very dark, but I think it gets more evocative on a darker level sometimes with poetry. What do you think about that?
I think it can be. I wish there's a great poem by Donald Lynch, and it's something. Um, I can't remember the title off the top of my head, and I'm not going to go look to see if the book is here. But it's something like the saddest girl I know, or I think is the title of it. We can find this out later on. Um, but she redacts the name of the person. She does a little bit of blackout poetry, and it's really it does it because it's a girl she knew, and it's about her not recognizing the signs and then seeing the signs later on, and then in retrospect seeing why this was the saddest girl in March, um, which comes from all manner of dark and unpleasant things, obviously. But the atmosphere and the tone is really well pitched. Um, because it's painting a portrait, a melancholic portrait is one thing, and it's quite cliched, I suppose, in a way. But she does pretty much the opposite of that, and she's not dismissive, but towards the end, it gets very, very sort of plaintive when sort of like the penny is dropping, which is a motif actually throughout a lot of horror that does relate to mental illness. The penny dropping eventually, and but I think, yeah, I think it can be quite evocative in that sense, and direct. I think it's the directness that is probably one of the most this striking qualities in poetry about such things, because poetry is one of those few mediums that you can use the second person in and nobody cares. Use second person in a film or a book and or a novel or a short, it gets annoying unless it's done really, really well.
Yeah.
But you do it in poetry and it works perfectly. It's, you almost nearly expect it to be, and oftentimes it's written in the present tense as well, which is, so yeah, there is that immediacy in it. But yeah, no, I would agree. I think it can be done, but I think it is, because when people write poetry, if if they do it honestly, they will. A lot of people tend to, it's almost like a journal almost. Like there is obviously the craft side to it, obviously. Um, but aside from that, there is always this, even when it's not the case, but that the lyrical I is the poet, even when it's not. Um, and it just, it always feels that it has that sort of personal. This is me telling you a story, or you telling me a story, as opposed to about this specific thing that happened in my life. You
Yeah.
know.
Yeah, I agree with even if it's not, because there was a poem a friend of mine liked that I wrote, and he asked me, it was about Paris, and he asked me if I'd ever been to Paris, and I said no. That was totally off, things I've read or seen, but not a personal experience at all. But he thought it was a personal experience, which was a compliment, I thought. But anyway,
Well,
so yeah, so with other genres like the psychological horror, um, do you find that it's people, you can play with it a little more, with them not being a personal experience, that you can bring more into it than with a poem?
well, you see, I think the issue with psychological horror, and I think this is the issue that needs to be, that you know is going around, that will always be, or is currently going around anyway. Maybe it'll stop eventually. Um, but it's how horror is represented, or sorry, excuse me, how how mental illness is represented in a story. And the problem with that is that sometimes people don't know what mental illness necessarily is, in terms of, they might not know the difference between a psychotic and a psychopath. So, which are huge differences, obviously. Um, you know, so it's And if you do look back at like like the early masters of psychological horror, like if you look at Poe or someone like that, while he's dealing with what you could say are deranged characters, it's not it's not accurate in relation to psychosis. Like in the Telltale Heart, there has never been someone who has undergone psychosis and their grief or their sense of guilt starts to makes them want to confess their crime. That that won't happen. Now, as someone who's psychotic who's read the Telltale Heart 150 times may do that, but they won't have killed someone more than likely.
Mhm.
Um, Now, so it doesn't necessarily have to be personal, but it's sort of like everything. If you're going to write about something, you need to know about it. You need to know your subject. So, um, there's it's sort of like when people say it's something good when they brought out that documentary on Netflix about Ted Bundy and someone said that he had bipolar, and I was like, no, he didn't, because I've witnessed people with bipolar and they can't function. They don't function. It would be extremely obvious if he had. Um, and it's so, whilst I think it's forgivable with the early ones when they're using it as symbolism, which is usually what they're doing. Like, the shadow with, the repressed grief or the guilt in Poe, and um, you know, Robert Bloch for his time knew a bit more, but in general, like the Lovecraftian one, like that's not madness at all.
Yeah, it's
You
not.
know, uh, it's just a way to end the story. um, you're going to get a whole bunch of H.P. Lovecraft people after you. Uh,
Well, I mean, it's not true. I mean, it's not true mental illness what they do in Lovecraft. That's very
no,
much played with intertwined with the supernatural and the eldritch gods sort of forcing their powers onto the human mind. So I mean, that's not true mental illness. I think it's an interesting concept to play with. I mean, I think as long as you make it clear that this is a supernatural thing and not like human mental illness. But yeah, it's not a good representation of mental illness at all.
no, no. But it's you see that's the other side of it as well. Is that you know I I don't know how upfront you need to be about what this is about this, or like I like ambiguity and things. Like there's like you could I was thinking about this, like way one reading of the Telltale Heart um that would make him psychotic would be if there was they never if he never killed anybody.
Mm.
If the whole thing was just a complete fabrication that
Yeah,
he
if
had
it
written then.
was all a
You know?
delusion.
Yeah. And similarly, I was reading just in preparation for this. I did do a little bit. Um, because the turn of the screw is one of the big ones in that. And I was reading an art, it was article about it, and the argument that they were making was because it's the children see ghosts in it, um, and there raising the question, or they were saying that asking whether or not there are actually ghosts in Turn of the Screw is missing the point, because what it's actually about is someone imposing their version of reality onto another. So that's not even really about mental health.
Mm.
This like the because Henry James was Henry James, yeah, was gets quite a bit of crap for that, because you know it's the mad woman who kills the children. Sorry, anybody who hasn't read it, but it's been out for over 100 years. But the thing is that you can like it's actually very prescient to the times we're living in. Someone saying this is reality, and I'm going to impose it and be very forceful in how I do so. I'm not going to listen to you, young people. So
Yeah.
you know, it's, and you see again, like it's it comes back to that the thing that basically psychiatry is quite new as well. That's the other side of it. It's only because it doesn't start with Freud. I only really consider psychiatry to start when they were able to treat when the drugs came in, basically, because you couldn't treat things like bipolar or or schizophrenia before there was certain medications came in and
Yeah.
were invented. So, and that only happened in the 50s and
Yeah.
60s.
And some of those early treatments, I'm not sure you could actually call them treatments because they were more along the lines of torture, some of them, but I mean,
Yeah.
yeah, I mean, the electroshock therapy and other things like that, it's like,
Well, I got that last year, so that one's still going.
well, yeah, but they've improved on that. I'm not talking about modern
But I
elect I mean,
bet
I'm talking
what
about,
I,
like, turn of the century stuff.
I bet you never heard of insulin shock therapy though.
No.
Yeah, this is a weird one. You know Townes Van Zandt, the singer.
Mhm.
Well, he was given this, and it damaged him quite a bit, and it was where they used to basically put you into a coma by ODing you pretty much ODing you on insulin, and it was they like it's been completely disproven, obviously,
Mm,
to be of any use. But it was used for treatment of depression and bipolar.
yeah, yeah,
It wasn't. Yeah, but that
yeah.
was a new discovery, the insulin one. But have you ever, if you that film Session 9, um, that's based in a hospital in Trenton, New Jersey. If you look up the history of the guy who ran that hospital in the early 1900s, yeah, you get quite interesting little
Mm,
asides. Anyway,
yeah. So, so when you're writing about mental illness, how do you handle stereotypes and avoid the cliches?
um, well, I think uh, like what's important is that if you if you're going to have a villain that you have to empathize, that you have to have a certain amount. Actually, you have to have a little bit of sympathy, because basically, like, by the way, the line that people who get angry about this um, say is that the majority of people with a mental illness are more likely to be victims of a crime than to commit one, and that might be true. I'm sure that is true, which is really reassuring when you're a psychiatric patient. But um, but then there are certain, but some do commit violent crimes. But the thing is that, and the example I always use, I always have to use a dog for some reason because people won't connect it otherwise. But it's like having it, if you were having a dream and a rabid dog was coming for you and going for your throat and you had to kill it, and then you woke up from the dream and your dog was dead by the side of the bed. Like, that's what people who suffer from psychosis like that, like, they're not devoid of things like empathy like a psychopath would be. They don't want to do this. They usually do these things they nearly always do these things out of fear. They're usually they usually believe that they're under threat of some sort. And that's why, like, there's very few, like, you won't find that many serial killers because they're usually very disorganized because they're terrified all the time. So that's why they don't work as the monster. Um, the monster is the illness in a sense. It's sort of like it's like Pazuzu in The Exorcist. But so to avoid the cliches is to, well, is to be aware that these people can have insight. Um, and will, and when if they do get that insight and realize what they've done, then they will feel grief unimaginable to us about it. But I think what's most important is not to just throw them into an asylum and have them bubbling like sort of Sam Neill in The Mouth of Madness. That's, I think, the worst cliche of them all, really, because that paints a bad image of hospitals as people with psychiatric problems, because they're not like that. So I think of all the cliches, the majority of them are forgivable. But I think it's that insane asylum one. That's the one that needs to be knocked on the head properly.
Yeah, too many people are taking inspiration from One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, I think.
Yeah.
But yeah, and it's interesting that you made the distinction between someone with a psychosis and a sociopath, because they are two different diagnoses and two different behavioral patterns. So yeah, definitely you need to do your research, I think, to avoid that sort of a thing. So now we're going to talk a little bit about the other side of mental health, and that's mental health issues that the writer actually has to work through, like things like depression, anxiety, burnout, and even neurodiversity. I don't particularly want to call neurodiversity a mental illness, but it is a different sort of a way to work than, say, someone who is not neurodiverse as well. So, how do you deal with that sort of thing?
Um,
How does it affect your writing?
it does affect my writing. The way what I find most difficult is it's if my routine gets knocked out, because I think routine is one of those key things to writing, to actually getting the words out. But when it sometimes it's not possible to just keep the routine up, which is whether that be that I'm in hospital, or and it's logistically not possible, or it's well, I will generally push myself to do something, but sometimes it's not. It's sort of like Leonard Cohen came out with a great line about that songwriting was a victory over mental illness. Um, Busy said, when you are depressed, you can't write. When you are that really, really, really down, like you don't have a chance. So if you have written anything, that's a victory. While you're doing it, but as I say, I think routine is it's a huge part of it for every writer. I think um, the routine aspect of it, that you go in and whatever that may be for you, whether it be you know a couple of hours a day, or so many words a day, but it's I think that is the key to it in the end. It's not about, like, we all everyone writes shit every so often, so it's not about sort of, you can come back and edit something, you can always do that, but it, when you're actually not writing, that's when it's difficult. So I would say that the routine is probably the key thing, and it's and what's great about routine is that when you're in it, it's second nature, but when you're out of it, it's very difficult to get back into, which is, so
Definitely.
that's the problem. Um,
Yeah. Yeah, I know. Because I mean, like, I've been suffering a little bit from burnout for these last couple of years because I had a really disastrous year in 2022, and it sort of just, like, it kicked me out of the routine, it kicked me out of the enjoyment of writing, and it's sort of like, I kept in a little bit, but it's like I just had to step back and take a break from it because it was just so overwhelming for me after what happened that year. So, I mean, I definitely understand, trying to get back into it because it's taken me this long just to get back into wanting to write again, really, instead of just having it just kind of like this obligation thing.
mm,
So,
yeah.
do you feel like that as well, or is it a different process?
Um, well, you see, I don't like giving advice too much, because it's because I do feel guilty if I'm not writing, and I can use that to make myself write. Um, but that's not necessarily a good device for other people either.
Mm,
It works for me, but you know, um, but yeah, no, I always find that if I'm I just sort of like to keep it as such as intrinsic a part of my day as I can. It and you have your days that are wonderful, and then you have your days that are just you're trudging with. I what I do like is I like that idea. There's someone that um, I think it was Roland S. Howard said it. That well, actually, unfortunately, it was Nick Cave, but he hasn't written a good line in what 30 years. So, so we'll say it was Roland S. Howard, but he said he mentioned a line that he was proud of, and he said, after I wrote that line, I took the rest of the day off, which I think that's something that we should we should probably practice as writers, that if we ever do get right one of those lines, that those ones that you're quite happy with yourself about. No, that's me for today. I'm going.
Yeah, go celebrate.
Yeah, you don't need to do more. What if you get that one line? I'm like, hey, why not?
Yeah, I mean, even if you're not suffering from depression or anxiety or anything like that, I mean, I think writers are way too hard on ourselves a lot of times as well. So yeah, we need to ease up a little bit and celebrate sometimes.
Yeah.
So,
Um,
do you think it's easier these days to talk about mental health? Do you think the stigmas and online discussions are kind of like the online discussions are helping, and you think the stigmas are kind of just going down a little bit? That it's not as much of a behind closed doors sort of thing?
um, I think there has been progress, but then there's been progress on all sides of it, like with the treatment of it as well. But on just on the sociological level, I think there has been progress made. But there's also been this thing of you know certain things being sort of hip or trendy. Oh, that's my OCD, or I have a little bit of bipolar. That's like saying I have a little bit of schizophrenia. No, you
Yeah, you're kind of bipolar or you're
can't
not.
have a little
Yeah.
bit. But it's one of these things, because I've seen OCD. I saw that went through a whole thing of like everyone had it. I think that would have been when Billy Bob Thornton was still married to Angelina Jolie, because I think he has it. But a lot of people said and then it suddenly got into the common discourse, and it's sort of like people are saying it without really knowing what it is, and it goes back to the psychosis psychotic, and which but the one thing I want to mention about that is that as well, in terms of law, um, the psychopath is not deemed insane. A psychotic is. So even though it's a psychiatrist who will diagnose it, it's not a defense in terms of a mental illness. Um, it's just it's a personality disorder in the same way that as a paraphilia would be. But anyway, that's
Yeah.
beside the point.
Yeah,
But
there are certain definitions in law that make someone culpable of a crime, and the psychopath falls on the yes, you are culpable side of it.
yes, mm, well, really, it's only, to be honest, psychosis is pretty much the only thing that will get you off, because it's about not being aware of what you're doing.
Yeah.
Um, DID is another one, which would be why Norman Bates would get off. Um, but Hannibal Lecter shouldn't be. He shouldn't be in a hospital.
No, no, I kind of agree with that one. He really should have been in jail because, yeah,
Yeah,
he knew what he was doing
yeah,
and
exactly.
he
Very,
enjoyed it.
very, yeah. With
But
flava beans, you know.
yeah, yeah, because historically, other cannibalistic serial killers have gone to jail. So yeah, there was a precedent that he should have been in jail and not in a sane asylum. But
Yeah.
then again, the story plot demanded he was in a sane asylum, I guess. So you take liberties there.
Well, if you
Although I think it could have worked just as well in jail as
well, if he's in just in a solitary confinement thing, like he, if
yeah.
is he in in Manhunter, it just looks like a prison. The original one where it's the Scottish actor playing, oh god, what's that?
But the
Brian
oh,
Cox.
mhm.
Brian Cox plays Hannibal Lecter. Is it Jonathan Demme directed it?
Yeah, I think yeah, it's the guy that was in the original CSI played the law enforcement. Oh, I can't remember the name.
Yeah, and the guy who now played, he's become famous now for basically saying "fuck off." The what's it called? He plays a version of Rupert Murdoch or something,
Mm.
I think. Um, I'm sorry for swearing in the middle of your podcast.
Oh no, don't worry about me. I'm used to swearing, and I do quite a bit of it myself when I'm not on camera. So yeah, I grew up in Nova
um,
Scotia. If you don't know how to swear by age 5, you something's wrong. So
good, good, good. Yeah, but actually, there was the one. I think I mentioned this to you. Just going back to um, the the avoiding the stereotype and everything like that. Um, there's this wonderful film by David Cronenberg called Spider, and it was based on a novel by Patrick McGrath, um, who grew up in Broadmoor. His father was the head of Broadmoor, which is the main psychiatric hospital for the criminally insane in England. Um, like that's where the Yorkshire Ripper was and all
mm,
this. So it's pretty hardcore. Um, but I won't spoil it completely, but it's just basically it starts with him leaving the asylum and he has to go back in at the end, right? That's not, I'm not, there's not too much of a plot spoil there. Um, but what's really beautiful is that when he gets back into the car to be to go back to the hospital, um, the doctor is sitting in the car beside him, and he's like, so you come back to us for a little while, and then he offers him a cigarette. I was like, yeah, because this man is not bad.
Mm.
He's just unwell. He deserves sympathy.
Mhm. Yeah.
Um, so it's like, and I would actually, the the end of the book is different to the end of the film. So I'd say the film is actually a better watch. And which is interesting because Patrick McGrath wrote the script as well as the novel, but he changed the ending. Um, but it really is, it works. It just shows it very, very well. And it came out the same year as A Beautiful Mind, which was a terrible film about schizophrenia, and showed a great. And instead, we got a great, and the great film about schizophrenia got wiped under the garbage.
Yeah, that probably had more to do with Hollywood money than the quality of the film. And I
Right.
think on that note, we'll wrap the
Mm,
interview. I'd like to thank you for being a guest. It was a pleasure chatting with you.
thank you.
Okay, and that's it for this episode. And join us next month when we talk to author John Ward about his middle grade horror Scareville series. So it should be an interesting chat. And that's all for now. Bye.